Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the popular imagination, the papacy represents moral authority, spiritual leadership, and the continuity of the Christian faith. The Pope, as the Vicar of Christ on earth, stands as the living embodiment of the Church's teachings and values. Yet, history reveals a far more complex and often troubling picture of the institution, particularly during the tumultuous centuries of the Middle Ages. From approximately the 9th to the 16th centuries, the papal throne was often a prize fought over by powerful families, ambitious clerics, and rival political factions. This period witnessed popes who engaged in behavior that ranged from merely questionable to shockingly immoral and even criminal. Their stories reveal not just personal failings, but also the profound challenges facing the medieval church as an institution straddling the spiritual and secular realms. The medieval papacy existed in a world of constant political upheaval. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the rise of feudalism, struggles between emerging nation-states, and contests between papal and imperial authority all contributed to an environment where the selection and behavior of popes often reflected worldly concerns more than spiritual ones. In many cases, the papal office became a tool for wealthy Roman families to extend their power and influence. This exploration of the most scandalous popes of the Middle Ages is not intended merely to titillate or to cast aspersions on the Catholic Church. Rather, it aims to understand these figures in their historical context, examining how their actions reflected and influenced the religious, political, and social currents of their times. By understanding the depths to which the papacy occasionally sank, we can better appreciate the reforms that eventually strengthened the institution and the remarkable resilience of the Church despite the human failings of its leaders. The pages that follow detail the lives and misdeeds of popes who engaged in murder, sexual excess, nepotism, simony, the selling of church offices, and political machinations that would make Machiavelli blush. Their stories are a reminder that even the most sacred institutions are ultimately human creations, vulnerable to the full spectrum of human virtues and vices. Before delving into the individual figures who earned infamy during this period, it's important to understand the historical context that gave rise to what has been called the Saeculum Obscurum, or Dark Age of the papacy. The early 10th century marked a nadir in papal authority and prestige. Following the collapse of Carolingian power, central Italy became a battleground for competing noble families, with the papacy as the ultimate prize. During this period, the powerful Theophylact family and their descendants effectively controlled the papal throne, installing their relatives and allies as popes. This era is sometimes referred to as the pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, a term coined by later church historians to describe the influence of powerful women like Theodora and her daughter Marozia, who were accused by their enemies of using sexual relationships to control papal politics. While such characterizations reflect the misogyny of medieval chroniclers as much as historical reality, they indicate the degree to which the papacy had become enmeshed in aristocratic family politics. During this period, the spiritual authority of the papacy reached its lowest ebb. Popes were installed and deposed with alarming frequency, sometimes through violence. The office became a political appointment rather than a spiritual calling, and the moral character of those who held it often reflected this reality. Pope Sergius III's rise to power exemplifies the brutal politics of this era. Originally elected pope in 898, He was quickly driven from Rome by supporters of Pope John V. However, with the backing of the local nobility, particularly the Theophylact family, Sergius returned to power in 904 and reigned until 911. Sergius's papacy was marked by violence and vindictiveness. According to historical accounts, he ordered the murders of his two immediate predecessors, Popes Leo V and Christopher, making him the only pope believed to have murdered other popes. This act alone would secure his place among the most infamous occupants of St. Peter's throne. Beyond these murders, Sergius was notorious for his relationship with Marozia, the daughter of Theophylact and Theodora. According to the chronicler Liutprand of Cremona, whose accounts are often sensationalized but nonetheless reflect contemporary perceptions, Serge and Marozia had an affair that produced an illegitimate son who would later become Pope John V. This connection established the pattern of familial control over the papacy that would characterize the pornocracy. Despite his moral failings, Sergius was an active builder and restorer of churches. He oversaw repairs to the Lateran Basilica, which had been damaged by an earthquake. This dual nature, morally corrupt yet engaged in traditionally papal activities, characterizes many of the scandalous popes of this period. Sergius's papacy represents the consolidation of aristocratic control over the church. The spiritual mission of the papacy had become secondary to its value as a political asset for powerful families. This pattern would continue for decades, reaching its nadir under one of the most notorious popes in history. If any single figure embodies the depths to which the papacy sank during the 10th century, it is Pope John XII. Born Octavian, he was the son of Alberic II of Spoleto, the ruler of Rome, and possibly the grandson of Marozia. When Alberic died in 954, he made the Roman nobles swear to elect his son as pope when the current pontiff died. True to their oath, they elected Octavian the following year, making him pope at the astonishingly young age of 18. John XII's youth and inexperience were matched by his apparent lack of spiritual vocation. Contemporary accounts describe a pope more interested in hunting, gambling, and sexual exploits than in church affairs. The Lateran Palace, the official papal residence, was allegedly transformed into something resembling a brothel during his tenure. The charges against John XII are extensive and shocking. According to his critics, he engaged in sexual relations with numerous women, including his father's concubine and his own niece. He was accused of ordaining a deacon in a stable, consecrating a 10-year-old boy as Bishop of Todi, and converting church offerings and treasures to fund his lifestyle. He reportedly invoked pagan gods while gambling and turned the Lateran Palace into a den of prostitution. German ruler Otto of Saxony, who would become Holy Roman Emperor with John's blessing, wrote to the young pope, "Everyone accuses you, Holiness, of homicide, perjury, sacrilege, incest with your relatives, including 2 of your sisters, and with having, like a pagan, invoked Jupiter, Venus, and other demons." John's political maneuvering was proved as disastrous as his personal conduct. When Otto first came to Rome in 962, John crowned him emperor, hoping to gain protection against his enemies. However, the Pope quickly regretted this decision when Otto began to assert his authority. John then allied himself with Otto's enemies, including the Hungarians. In response, Otto returned to Rome, forcing John to flee. The emperor convened a synod that deposed John and elected Leo VIII in his place. John's end was as scandalous as his life. According to the most widely accepted account, he died at age 27 after being severely beaten by a jealous husband who caught the Pope in bed with his wife. Other accounts suggest he died of a stroke while in the act of adultery, or from injuries sustained falling from a window while attempting to escape the cuckolded husband. John XII's pontificate represents the nadir of the pornocracy. A pope with no spiritual qualifications or interests, whose personal conduct violated every tenet of Christian morality, and whose political judgments were disastrous for both himself and the Church. That such a figure could occupy the chair of St. Peter indicates how thoroughly the papacy had become a political prize rather than a spiritual office. If John XII represents the moral nadir of the 10th century papacy, Benedict IX exemplifies the depths to which the institution had sunk by the early 11th century. Benedict holds the dubious distinction of being the only man to serve as pope on 3 separate occasions, as well as being the only pope to sell the papal office. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum, Benedict came from the powerful Tusculan family, descendants of the Theophylax who had dominated papal politics in the previous century. Through family influence, he was elected pope in 1032, possibly when he was as young as 12, though more likely around 20. Regardless of his exact age, Benedict was certainly too young and unprepared for such a position. Contemporary accounts describe Benedict as dissolute and corrupt. The chronicler Desiderius, who later became Pope Victor III, wrote that Benedict led a life so vile, so foul, so execrable, that I shudder to think of it. He was accused of multiple adulteries and murders, with St. Peter Damian describing his residence as a brothel of whores and a school for Satan. Benedict's first pontificate was marked by instability. In 1044, he was driven from Rome by a popular uprising. Though he returned with the support of Emperor Conrad II, Benedict decided in 1045 to abdicate the papacy, an almost unprecedented move. More shocking still was his reason. He sold the papal office to his godfather, John Gratian, who became Pope Gregory VI, for a large sum of gold. The traditional explanation for this extraordinary transaction was Benedict's desire to marry. Having tired of the restrictions of the papal office, or perhaps having fallen in love, he decided that the papacy was a fair trade for the freedom to pursue matrimony. However, Benedict soon regretted his decision. With the help of the powerful Crescentii family, he reclaimed the papal throne in 1047. Creating a 3-way papal schism between himself, Gregory VI, and Sylvester III, who had been elected during Benedict's first exile. Emperor Henry III intervened, deposing all 3 popes and installing Clement VI. After Clement's death in 1047, Benedict seized the papal throne one final time, only to be permanently removed by imperial forces in 1048. Benedict IX's pontificate represent the absolute degradation of the papacy as a spiritual office, that the highest position in the Church could be bought and sold like a commodity, demonstrated how thoroughly corrupted the institution had become. Yet this very nadir would help spark the reformist movement that would eventually transform the medieval Church. Among all the scandals that have besmirched the papacy throughout its history, perhaps none is as bizarrely macabre as the so-called Cadaver Synod conducted by Pope Stephen VI in 897. This grotesque event not only demonstrated the depths of political vengeance in medieval Rome, but also represented a shocking desecration of papal dignity. The target of Stephen's posthumous vendetta was Pope Formosus, who had died in April 896. Formosus had been a controversial figure in life, having been excommunicated by Pope John VIII before eventually being restored and ultimately elected Pope himself. During his pontificate, 891 to 896, Formosus became embroiled in the complex political struggles of the time, particularly regarding the imperial succession. When Stephen VI became Pope in 896, he decided to put his predecessor on trial. In an unprecedented move, he ordered Formosus' corpse to be exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, and propped up on a throne to answer charges of perjury, coveting the papacy, and violating church canons while Bishop of Porto. The spectacle that followed was as gruesome as it was absurd. The decomposing corpse, now 9 months dead, was assigned a deacon to answer on its behalf, while Stephen hurled accusations at it. Unsurprisingly, the deceased Formosus was found guilty on all counts. The synod declared all of his acts and ordinations invalid, stripped the corpse of its sacred vestments, cut off the 3 fingers of his right hand used for blessings, and ultimately cast the body into the Tiber River. This act of desecration was not merely personal vindictiveness. It had profound theological and ecclesiastical implications. By invalidating Formosus's ordinations, Stephen effectively nullified the spiritual authority of all clergy ordained during Formosus's papacy, a decision with far-reaching practical consequences that threatened to throw the church into chaos. The traditional explanation for Stephen's actions involves political vengeance. Formosus had supported Arnulf of Carinthia for the imperial crown, while Stephen was aligned with the rival house of Spoleto. However, recent scholarship suggests a more complex motivation. Historian William S. Monroe argues that the Cadaver Synod was an attempt to prevent the veneration of Formosus as a saint. By desecrating the body and casting it into the Tiber, Stephen sought to ensure that no relics remained around which a cult could develop. Whatever Stephen's precise motivations, his actions horrified many Romans. The spectacle of a pope putting his predecessor's corpse on trial struck many as sacrilegious. Within months, a popular uprising against Stephen resulted in his imprisonment and ultimately his strangulation. His pontificate had lasted only about a year, but it would be remembered for centuries as one of the most disturbing episodes in papal history. The Cadaver Synod represents more than just a macabre spectacle. It symbolizes the nadir of papal authority and prestige in the late 9th century. That a pope could treat his predecessor's remains with such disrespect, and in turn be murdered himself, demonstrates how thoroughly the papal office had been corrupted by political factionalism and personal vendettas. The papacy had become not just a political prize, but a weapon to be wielded against enemies, living or dead. In 898, Pope Theodore II reinstated Formosus and had his body, which had been recovered from the Tiber by a monk, reburied with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica. The full rehabilitation of Formosus came under Pope John IX, who declared the Cadaver Synod illegal and had all records of it burned. Nevertheless, the damage to papal prestige had been done, and the grotesque spectacle would remain an indelible stain on the history of the papacy. By the late 15th century, the papacy had recovered much of its authority and prestige after the reforms of the 11th and 12th centuries and the return from Avignon. However, the Renaissance era brought its own form of corruption, as popes increasingly behaved like secular princes, patronizing the arts, engaging in power politics, and advancing their families' interests. No pontiff exemplifies these tendencies more notoriously than Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. Born in Spain, Rodrigo Borgia came to Italy as a young man when his uncle became Pope Calixtus III in 1455. The young Borgia quickly accumulated church offices and wealth, becoming vice-chancellor of the Roman Church, a position he held for decades. During this time, he lived luxuriously and openly acknowledged his numerous children by various mistresses. Borgia's election to the papacy in 1492 was widely attributed to simony, the buying of church offices. As Cardinal Ascanio Sforza reportedly remarked, "The Pope has sold the keys, the altar, and Christ himself." Once in power, Alexander VI dedicated himself to 2 primary goals: securing his position politically and advancing the interests of his family, particularly his children. The most notorious aspect of Alexander's papacy was his shameless nepotism. He appointed his son Cesare, then only 18, as cardinal, despite the young man's evident lack of spiritual vocation. His daughter Lucrezia was used as a political pawn, married 3 times to secure political alliances. His son Juan was made Duke of Gandia and Captain General of the Papal Army. When Juan was murdered in 1497, with some suspecting Cesare's involvement, Alexander was overwhelmed with grief, briefly promising church reform before returning to his previous ways. Alexander's personal life continued to scandalize the church, even after becoming pope. He allegedly maintained a relationship with the beautiful Julia Farnese, nicknamed the Bride of Christ, and fathered additional children while pope. The Borgia papal apartments became notorious for lavish parties that sometimes descended into debauchery. While some accounts from his enemies are undoubtedly exaggerated, there is substantial evidence of Alexander's continued sexual activities during his pontificate. Beyond his personal conduct, Alexander's political machinations were equally troubling. He used the church's resources to carve out territories for his children, particularly after Cesare abandoned his cardinalate to pursue a military career. The Pope allied with and betrayed various Italian states and foreign powers based on what would best serve Borgia interests rather than those of the Church. One of the most notorious incidents of Alexander's reign was the Banquet of Chestnuts, described by the papal master of ceremonies Johann Burchard. According to this account, Alexander hosted an evening of debauchery in the papal apartments, where naked courtesans crawled on hands and knees, picking up chestnuts, followed by a sexual contest with prizes for the men who could perform with the greatest number of women. Alexander died in 1503, possibly from malaria, though rumors of poisoning circulated wildly. According to contemporary accounts, his body quickly decomposed in the summer heat, becoming so bloated and disfigured that it could barely be fitted into its coffin. A physical corruption that many saw as emblematic of his spiritual state. While Alexander VI's personal immorality was shocking, his papacy had significant political accomplishments. He successfully navigated the dangerous waters of Italian politics and maintained the papal states against various threats. He signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal, and patronized artistic and architectural projects that enhanced Rome's beauty. Nevertheless, Alexander VI became the archetype of papal corruption during the Renaissance, a pontiff who treated the church as a family business, and the papal office as a means to power and wealth, rather than a spiritual calling. His excesses contributed significantly to the growing calls for church reform that would culminate in the Protestant Reformation shortly after his death. While some popes scandalized the faithful through moral corruption, others did so through excessive ambition and abuse of power. Pope Boniface VIII exemplifies this latter category. His pontificate, though free from the sexual excesses of some of his predecessors and successors, was marked by megalomaniacal claims of papal authority that ultimately damaged the Church. Born Benedetto Caetani to a noble family, Boniface ascended to the papacy under controversial circumstances. His predecessor, the elderly hermit Celestine V, had been elected as a compromise candidate, but proved wholly unsuited to the office. After just 5 months, Celestine took the unprecedented step of abdicating. Rumors persisted that Caetani, then a cardinal, had manipulated Celestine into this decision, possibly by speaking through a hidden tube to convince the simple hermit that God wanted him to resign. Whether or not these accusations were true, Boniface quickly moved to prevent any challenge to his legitimacy by imprisoning the former pope, who died in captivity within a year. This harsh treatment of his saintly predecessor damaged Boniface's reputation from the start of his reign. Once in power, Boniface proved to be an aggressive proponent of papal supremacy. In 1302, he issued the bull Unum Sanctum, which represented the most extreme statement of papal authority ever made. The document declared that it was altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff, effectively claiming that submission to papal authority was required for salvation. This expansive view of papal power alienated secular rulers across Europe. Boniface's most fateful conflict was with King Philip IV of France. The dispute began over taxation of clergy, but escalated into a fundamental clash over the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. Philip's propaganda campaign against Boniface included allegations of heresy, sorcery, and immorality. One particularly shocking accusation was that Boniface had declared that sexual abuse of boys was no more problematic than rubbing one hand against the other. The conflict culminated in a violent confrontation. In 1303, Philip's minister Guillaume de Nogaret led an armed band to Anagni, where Boniface was residing, intending to arrest the Pope and bring him to France for trial. Though Boniface was freed after 3 days, the shock and humiliation of this outrage of Anagni broke his health and spirit. He died a month later in Rome. Boniface's papacy is remembered not just for its claim to extreme papal authority, but also for its vindictiveness. He ordered the complete destruction of the city of Palestrina, home of his enemies the Colonna family, and sowed salt in its fields, a punishment of biblical proportions motivated by a personal vendetta. This act of vengeance, along with his treatment of Celestine V and his megalomaniacal claims, earned him a place in Dante's Inferno, where the poet placed him in the 8th circle of hell among the simoniacs. While Boniface VIII did not engage in the sexual immorality or nepotism that characterized some scandalous popes, his abuse of power for personal vendettas and his extreme claims of papal authority did serious damage to the Church. The conflict he initiated with the French crown ultimately led to the Avignon papacy and later the Western Schism, periods of profound crisis for the medieval Church. His pontificate demonstrates that scandal could arise not just from personal immorality, but from the misuse of spiritual authority for worldly ends. The Avignon papacy, 1309 to 1376, when 7 consecutive French popes resided in Avignon rather than Rome, represents a complex chapter in church history. While the arrangement had legitimate political reasons behind it, many contemporaries viewed it as a scandal, a betrayal of the papacy's Roman heritage, and a submission to French royal interests. Among the Avignon popes, Clement VI stands out for his ostentatious lifestyle and worldly approach to the papal office. Born Pierre Roger to a minor noble family in France, Clement had a distinguished career as a theologian, diplomat, and administrator before his election as pope in 1342. Unlike some scandalous popes, Clement was intellectually accomplished and administratively competent. His scandal lay not in incompetence or moral depravity, but in transforming the papal court into a center of luxurious living that seemed at odds with Christian ideals of simplicity and humility. Under Clement, the papal palace at Avignon became one of the most magnificent courts in Europe. He spent lavishly on art, music, and architecture, expanding the palace and decorating it sumptuously. Clement maintained a household of hundreds, including numerous relatives whom he appointed to lucrative church positions. When criticized for this nepotism, he reportedly responded that his predecessors had not known how to be popes. Clement's court was notorious for its feasts, entertainment, and the presence of beautiful women. Though not accused of personal sexual impropriety, Clement was known for his appreciation of female company and beauty. He reportedly remarked that he had lived as a sinner among sinners. His love of luxury extended to his personal appearance. He dressed magnificently and lived like a secular prince rather than a spiritual leader. This lifestyle required enormous funds, which Clement raised through an expansion of the papal fiscal system. He increased the range of church positions subject to papal appointment, and thus payment, demanded higher service fees, and expanded the sale of indulgences. These financial practices, while effective at funding his court, generated growing criticism and calls for reform. Clement's papacy coincided with catastrophic events that made his luxury seem particularly inappropriate. The Black Death ravaged Europe during his reign, killing perhaps a third of the population. While Clement should be credited for remaining in Avignon during the plague, when many fled, and for condemning the persecution of Jews as scapegoats, his continued lavish lifestyle amid such suffering struck many as callous. Despite these excesses, Clement was an effective administrator and diplomat. He managed church affairs competently and worked to broker peace between England and France during the 100 Years' War. He was also a noted patron of learning, founding a library and supporting universities. Clement died in 1352, leaving a mixed legacy. While not guilty of the gross immorality of some notorious popes, his transformation of the papacy into a court rivaling those of secular monarchs represented a significant departure from apostolic simplicity. The contrast between his luxury and the suffering caused by the Black Death seemed to embody the growing distance between the institutional church and the spiritual ideals it claimed to represent. The excesses of the Avignon papacy, exemplified by Clement VI, contributed to growing calls for reform that would eventually lead to the Western Schism and, ultimately, the Protestant Reformation. Clement's papacy demonstrates that scandal could arise not just from outright immorality, but from a worldliness that seemed incompatible with authentic spiritual leadership. While individual popes could bring scandal to the church through their personal conduct, perhaps no situation was more damaging to papal prestige than the Great Western Schism, when rival lines of popes simultaneously claimed legitimacy. For nearly 40 years, Western Christendom was divided in its allegiance, with different nations recognizing different popes. This unprecedented situation raised profound questions about the nature of church authority and undermined the papacy's claim to represent Christian unity. The schism began after Pope Gregory IX returned the papal court to Rome from Avignon in 1377, ending nearly 7 decades of French-dominated papacy. When Gregory died in 1378, the Roman populace, determined to secure an Italian pope who would remain in Rome, pressured the cardinals during the conclave. Under this duress, they elected Urban VI, an Italian archbishop. Urban proved to be mentally unstable and abusive toward the cardinals, many of whom were French and longed to return to Avignon. Claiming that Urban's election had been invalid due to the mob pressure, a group of cardinals elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who established his court at Avignon. Europe divided its loyalties, with France, Spain, Scotland, and southern Italy supporting Clement, while England, Germany, Scandinavia, and northern Italy recognized Urban. The situation became even more complex when both papal lines continued through succession. When Urban died, the Roman cardinals elected Boniface IX. When Clement died, the Avignon cardinals elected Benedict XIII. For decades, there were always at least 2 competing popes, each with his own college of cardinals, administrative structure, and supporters. Attempts to resolve the schism through negotiation failed, as neither line would concede legitimacy to the other. The way of cession, in which both popes would resign, and the way of compromise, submitting to arbitration, both foundered on the unwillingness of the claimants to risk losing their positions. Finally, in 1409, Cardinals from both lines organized the Council of Pisa, which claimed authority to resolve the situation. The council deposed both existing popes and elected a new one, Alexander V. However, since neither of the existing popes accepted the council's authority to depose them, this action merely created a third line of claimants, further complicating the situation. The schism was finally resolved at the Council of Constance, 1414–1418. By this time, the Roman line was represented by Gregory XII, the Avignon line by Benedict III, and the Pisan line by John III, not to be confused with the 20th century pope of the same name. The council secured Gregory's voluntary resignation and deposed the other two claimants, then elected Martin V as the sole legitimate pope in 1417. The Great Western Schism had profound consequences for the Church. Most obviously, it severely damaged papal prestige. The spectacle of multiple popes excommunicating each other and competing for resources and recognition made a mockery of papal claims to supreme spiritual authority. How could the Pope be the vicar of Christ when Christendom couldn't even agree on who the Pope was? More fundamentally, the schism raised ecclesiological questions about the nature of church authority. The conciliar movement that emerged from this crisis argued that a general council representing the entire church held authority superior to that of the Pope, a direct challenge to the doctrine of papal supremacy that had developed over the previous centuries. While Martin V and his successors would eventually reassert papal authority over councils, the damage had been done. The schism also accelerated the nationalization of church institutions, as different kingdoms supported different popes and gained concessions from them in return. This further eroded the universality of the medieval church and contributed to the conditions that would later facilitate the splintering of Western Christianity during the Reformation. While the Great Western Schism did not involve the personal immorality that characterized some scandalous papal reigns, it represents perhaps the greatest institutional failure of the medieval papacy. The inability to maintain even the basic unity of the office undermined its fundamental claim to be the center of Christian unity and the supreme spiritual authority on earth. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the papacy increasingly resembled a secular principality, with popes acting more as temporal rulers than spiritual leaders. This transformation reached its apotheosis in Pope Julius II, nicknamed Il Papa Terribile, the fearsome pope and the warrior pope, for his aggressive policies and personal participation in military campaigns. Born Giuliano della Rovere to a modest family, Julius rose in the church hierarchy under the patronage of his uncle, Pope Sixtus IV. As cardinal, he was a bitter opponent of Alexander VI, going into exile during the Borgia Pope's reign. Upon his election in 1503, Julius was already elderly, but bursting with energy and ambition, determined to restore and expand the temporal power of the papacy. Unlike some scandalous popes, Julius was not primarily known for sexual immorality or nepotism, though he had fathered at least one illegitimate daughter before becoming pope. His scandal lay in his thoroughgoing militarism, which seemed incompatible with the office of Christ's vicar. Julius personally led armies in the field, wearing armor and directing sieges, activities that struck many contemporaries as inappropriate for a spiritual leader. Julius's military campaigns were primarily aimed at restoring papal control over territories in central Italy that had fallen away during the turbulent years of the Borgia papacy. He successfully drove Cesare Borgia from the Papal States, and then turned his attention to the Republic of Venice, which had occupied several papal cities. After forming the League of Cambrai with France and the Holy Roman Empire, Julius defeated Venice and recovered the lost territories. The Pope's martial activities became the object of satire and criticism. Desiderius Erasmus, the great humanist scholar, wrote Julius Excluded from Heaven, a dialogue in which St. Peter refuses to admit the warrior pope through the pearly gates. Even more damaging was the Pope's reputation for foul language and violent temper, traits more associated with a mercenary captain than a spiritual leader. Beyond his military campaigns, Julius was known for his patronage of the arts. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael to decorate the papal apartments. He initiated the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, laying the cornerstone for the magnificent structure that stands today. These cultural achievements, while impressive, required enormous funds, which Julius raised through taxation and the sale of church offices. Julius also suffered from venereal disease, likely syphilis, contracted through sexual activity prior to his election. According to contemporary accounts, by the end of his life, the disease had progressed to the point where his feet were so covered with sores that no one could kiss them during traditional ceremonies, a grotesque detail that symbolized for many the corruption of the Renaissance papacy. While Julius II was in many ways an effective temporal ruler who restored and expanded papal territories, his thoroughly secular approach to the papacy contributed significantly to the growing calls for church reform. The spectacle of the Vicar of Christ leading armies, sweating profusely, and suffering from sexually transmitted diseases embodied the worldliness that reformers denounced. Martin Luther, who visited Rome during Julius's pontificate, was reportedly shocked by the corruption and secularism he witnessed, an experience that contributed to his later break with Rome. Julius II's pontificate represents the culmination of the Renaissance papacy's focus on temporal power at the expense of spiritual authority. While not guilty of the depravities of an Alexander VI or a John VII, Julius's transformation of the papacy into an aggressive secular principality scandalized many faithful and contributed to the climate that would soon produce the Protestant Reformation. Following the warrior Pope Julius II, the Church elected Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent of Florence, who took the name Leo X. If Julius represented the papacy as militant secular principality, Leo embodied the institution as a center of Renaissance culture, luxury, and patronage, often at the expense of spiritual concerns. Leo was elected at the age of 37, having been made a cardinal at just 13 through his father's influence. Though trained in theology and canon law, Leo's primary interests lay in literature, art, music, and the pleasures of refined living. Upon his election, he reportedly declared to his brother, "God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it," a statement that, whether apocryphal or not, aptly summarizes his approach to the office. As Pope, Leo transformed Rome into a brilliant cultural center. He patronized artists, musicians, and scholars, spending lavishly on festivals, hunts, comedies, and other entertainments. His court became known for its magnificence, with elaborate banquets, theatrical performances, and musical events. While these activities enhanced Rome's cultural prestige, they required enormous expenditure at a time when calls for ecclesiastical reform were growing louder. To fund his lifestyle and cultural patronage, as well as the continuing construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica, Leo resorted to questionable financial practices. He created and sold new offices, awarded benefices in return for payments, and most notoriously, expanded the sale of indulgences. It was Leo's indulgence campaign, particularly as promoted in Germany by Johann Tetzel, that provoked Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, the event traditionally marking the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. While Leo was not personally immoral by Renaissance standards, he was not known for sexual scandals or extreme nepotism, His thoroughly secular approach to the papacy represented a profound failure of spiritual leadership at a critical moment. When Luther's challenges to church practices began to spread, Leo initially dismissed them as the ramblings of a drunken German, and failed to recognize the serious theological and pastoral issues at stake. By the time he excommunicated Luther in 1521, the Reform movement had gained too much momentum to be stopped by papal decree. Leo's extravagance left the papal treasury depleted upon his death in 1521, despite all his financial machinations. This fiscal irresponsibility represented a betrayal of his responsibilities as steward of the Church's resources, particularly given the pressing needs for genuine reform. The contrasts of Leo's papacy are striking. Under his patronage, Rome reached new heights of cultural brilliance, yet the spiritual mission of the Church was neglected. He supported great artistic achievements like Raphael's work in the Vatican, yet failed to address the legitimate grievances that were splintering Western Christianity. He cultivated an image of learned refinement, yet responded to the most significant theological challenge of his time with dismissive incomprehension. Leo X's papacy demonstrates that scandal could arise not just from outright immorality, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of the papal office's primary purpose. By treating the papacy as an opportunity for cultural patronage and refined living, rather than spiritual leadership, Leo contributed significantly to the conditions that would soon divide Western Christianity for centuries to come. The scandalous behavior of certain medieval popes had far-reaching consequences for the Church and Western Christianity. While it would be simplistic to attribute the Protestant Reformation solely to papal misconduct, the accumulated weight of these scandals certainly contributed to the climate that made the Reformation possible. By the early 16th century, calls for reform in head and members had been resounding for decades. The conciliar movement of the 15th century had attempted to address institutional problems, but ultimately failed to implement lasting changes. Humanist scholars like Erasmus criticized ecclesiastical corruption while remaining within the Church. Yet the papacy, particularly under Renaissance popes like Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X, seemed incapable of meaningful self-reform. When Martin Luther visited Rome in 1510–11, during the reign of Julius II, he was shocked by the worldliness and corruption he witnessed in what should have been the spiritual capital of Christianity. This experience contributed to his growing disillusionment with the institutional Church. Similar reactions from other visitors to Rome suggest that the gap between the papacy's spiritual claims and its worldly reality had become too wide to ignore. The financing of Renaissance papal courts through practices like the sale of indulgences provided the immediate trigger for Luther's protest. Pope Leo X's expansion of indulgences to finance the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica directly triggered Luther's protest, which ignited the Protestant Reformation. Once set in motion, this movement found fertile ground in part because of the accumulated scandals of previous popes. The contrast between Christ's teachings of humility and service and the opulent worldly lives of Renaissance popes like Alexander VI and Julius II was simply too stark to ignore. The scandals also had profound effects on the development of political thought in Europe. The excesses of popes like Boniface VIII, who claimed absolute authority over secular rulers, prompted theologians and political philosophers to articulate more clearly the distinction between spirit and temporal authority. This intellectual current would eventually contribute to the development of modern concepts of separation of church and state. Within the Catholic Church itself, the scandals of the medieval papacy ultimately prompted significant reforms. The Council of Trent, 1545-1563, convened in response to the Protestant Reformation, implemented numerous changes to address the abuses that had scandalized the faithful. Measures against simony, nepotism, and clerical immorality were strengthened, and requirements for the education and moral character of clergy were enhanced. Looking back at the scandals of medieval popes from our contemporary perspective requires careful historical judgment. While it is appropriate to recognize and condemn the moral failings and abuses of power that occurred, it is also important to understand these figures within their historical context. The medieval papacy existed in a world fundamentally different from our own. In an era when political power was often maintained through family connections and brute force, the papacy was both a spiritual office and a territorial principality that had to be defended against various threats. The blending of spiritual and temporal authority created inherent tensions that sometimes led popes to prioritize worldly concerns over spiritual ones. Furthermore, our knowledge of some of the most notorious popes comes largely from their enemies and critics. Liutprand of Cremona, whose accounts of the pornocracy are our primary source for that period, was writing partially to justify Otto I's intervention in Italian affairs. The accusations against Alexander VI, while based on substantial evidence, were sometimes exaggerated by his political opponents. This doesn't excuse genuine misconduct, but reminds us to approach historical accounts with appropriate skepticism. It is also worth noting that for every scandalous pope, there were others who served with distinction and genuine spiritual dedication. Figures like Gregory I the Great, Leo I, Nicholas I, and Gregory VII made significant contributions to the development of Christian theology, church organization, and the protection of the vulnerable. The medieval papacy's legacy is complex and cannot be reduced to either uncritical veneration or wholesale condemnation. The scandalous popes of the Middle Ages present a paradox at the heart of the Catholic Church's history. On one hand, the moral failings of these individuals seem fundamentally at odds with the spiritual mission of the institution they led. On the other hand, the Church survived these scandals and eventually implemented reforms that addressed many of the underlying issues. This resilience speaks to the distinction that Catholics make between the office and the individual who holds it. The doctrine of ex cathedra, papal infallibility, applies only to official teachings on faith and morals, not to the personal conduct of popes. Similarly, Catholic theology holds that the efficacy of sacraments does not depend on the moral character of the priest who administers them. Nevertheless, the scandals of the medieval papacy had real and lasting consequences. They contributed to the Protestant Reformation, which permanently divided Western Christianity. They prompted needed reforms within the Catholic Church itself. And they remain a cautionary tale about the dangers of conflating spiritual authority with temporal power and the corrupting influence of wealth and privilege on religious institutions. Perhaps most importantly, these scandals remind us that even the most sacred institutions are ultimately human creations, led by individuals with all the virtues and flaws that humanity entails. The true strength of such institutions lies not in presenting a facade of perfection, but in their capacity for self-criticism, adaptation, and renewal in the face of human failings. The history of the scandalous popes thus offers not just a titillating glimpse into past corruption, but a profound meditation on the nature of religious authority, the relationship between spiritual ideals and worldly realities, and the enduring human struggle to live up to our highest values. In understanding these complex figures within their historical context, we gain insight not just into the medieval church, but into the perennial challenges facing all human institutions that aspire to embody transcendental ideals.